Hi guys, Chris from the Ultimate Recycler. I'm here with a vintage Malvern Star bicycle which I picked up in a shed clean out deal quite a while back. I'll link the series for that up above. We did a few videos on that one and we found some good stuff, and this was amongst it. And at the time I said I'm taking that bike home and I'm going to do a restoration project on it. Well, that was ages ago. It's been getting under my feet ever since, so it's time to tackle it. It's an absolute classic, this one. It's a vintage Malvern Star. I'm not sure on the era. I'm guessing maybe 1980s, correct me if I'm wrong. What I liked about it was that it's so complete. It's got the pack rack on the back, it's got all the lights, it's got the transfers, the paint job's still pretty good. It has got a bit of rust on it, a bit of surface rust, and it's a bit dusty, and the tyres are obviously had it. It's been sitting in a shed for a long time. The wiring there to the little headlight looks a bit dodgy, but you can see there's quite a lot of surface rust. So we're going to tackle a bit of a clean up here. I'm not going to go overboard, but I will dismantle it. We'll grease the bearings. It won't be anything particularly complicated, and we'll see if we can get rid of some of that surface rust on the chrome. Now, it's a little crowded in my shed and I really shouldn't be starting another project, but as I said, this one's been getting in the road. I don't need it here. I'm not going to keep it myself. It is to be sold, but I thought I might as well go to a bit of effort and clean it all up. We'll get a much better price for it. It's probably not going to be worth it for the time, but I get a video out of it. You guys get to see how I tackle these things, and it's extremely satisfying. I'll probably buy some new tubes and tyres for it, because I can certainly get better money for it if it's actually usable. So we're going to put it up on the table for a start, and I'll turn it upside down and we'll take the wheels off. Now, anytime you're working on bikes, it's much easier to tip them upside down. Most of them will sit on the seat and both sides of the handlebars to give you like a tripod. You do have to make sure that there's no bells or anything that are actually going to interfere with that. But it allows us to take the wheels off, and even just if you're doing some basic maintenance, it allows you to feel the wheel bearings, make sure there's no slop in them. They spin nice and freely without binding. It's also, you can actually operate the pedals, you can inspect the chain, and it looks like this bike isn't damaged, which is great, but we are going to pull it down and clean it up. So I'll start by taking both the wheels off it. I'll remove some of the accessories. It has got a little dynamo here to run the light, so we'll have to check the wiring there. We'll take the light off as well, and we'll basically strip it down. And that's probably all I'll do today. Strip it down, we'll put all the parts in boxes, take a few photos if I'm a bit unsure about where things go or which way they bolt up, but most bikes are pretty simple. And then we'll look at cleaning up each part and gradually reassembling it, greasing the bearings, and we do have to tackle all that surface rust. Just before we start dismantling, let's do a few basic checks to see if there's going to be any major problems. I'm just going to spin the wheels. I'll do it the front and the back. And we're just looking at the side of the rim, not the tyre, and it looks to be pretty good. There's not much wobble in there at all. It's a little bit hard to tell with the tyre being flat in one section, but I wanted to see if the rim's buckled. Quite often the front ones, if someone's ridden it on a curb or through a big hole or something, they can buckle the rim. You can fix the buckles a little bit with the spokes by tightening up one side, but I think this one's pretty good. The other thing to check is the crank bearings here. It rotates okay. We're going to pull it apart and grease it, but there appears to be no up and down lateral movement on the bearing, which is good. And the back rim will check for being warped or not as well. It's easier to make these checks right at the start, then you know what you're up for. I did just notice that the stand is broken off, so we can probably take that stand right off it. I don't know if I've got a spare one, but it doesn't matter. Everything else looks to be in pretty good order. The chain is very, very dirty, so we'll take that off and give it a soak, and we'll check the condition of the chain once we clean it up. Anyway, time to start dismantling. Wheels are off, and I'm just looking at the wiring of the little dynamo here. I've never actually had a bike with a dynamo set up. When I was young, our bikes were just pretty rough and ready. We grew up on a farm, and we didn't have flash things like lights. I'm gathering that it's just simply a power supply. There's two wires. One probably went to the backlight. There's like a tail light, and the other one went to the headlight. So I'm just going to take all these off. They're it's just secured with electrical tape. I'll clean all that up, take it all off. I think I will probably use cable ties or something when I put it back together, and we'll probably do a separate video on getting the lights going and cleaning them up and testing them. And I'm thinking, rather than just drone on and on, I will break this down to a few parts. So this part will basically be the introduction and the teardown, and then we'll look at revitalizing the chrome and cleaning the rust off as best we can in a separate video. The dynamo and the electricals in another video perhaps, and then greasing the bearings and reassembly, just so it breaks it up so the videos aren't super long ones, and we can have a bit of a series going. For anyone that's done any work on bikes, you'll probably, well, you will know, but most people who haven't done work on bikes won't. The chain actually goes through the frame, so even if you've got the chain off the sprockets, you can't just pull it out. So you need to look for a joining link. It could be on the outside or the inside. I find most of them are usually on the inside. Not that I do a lot of bikes. And I think I saw it here before. There it is, right there. So that's the joining link you want to look for. That's just a little spring clip on the outside. So we'll lever that off, and then the pin will pull out the other side and the chain will come apart. Another trick for dismantling bikes is the cranks are held on by a tapered pin. So it's not a bolt. I've undone the, well, I've loosened the nut on that side. And the best way I find to remove these is to undo the nut until it's flush with the end of the pin. And then, because they're a taper, they need a bit of a jar to get to knock out. So I'll give that a clout with the hammer there now. And by leaving a nut on just flush with the end of the pin, it's protecting the threads. If you were to hit it without the nut there, you would squash the threads and you would not be able to put the nut back on without a bit of repair work. So I'll give that a hit and see if it jars loose. There we go, I think that went in. I'm not sure, I wasn't watching through the camera. But yeah, there we go, she's moved out a little bit. So that's all we need to do. It'll pretty much just fall out now, and that's the safest way to remove those pins. And there we go, you can see how they fit. It's a tapered side on it, and it just basically, when you tap it in, it jams up tight and the nut will hold it there. And obviously what you saw me do was to tap it this way and then it frees it up. Now to take the crank assembly apart, the bearings, we've got to undo this locking collar. There's one on the other side as well. This side is left-hand thread. So I just loosened it before. I don't have a proper bicycle tool for this, and there's also a tool to adjust the actual bearing holder. Unless you're doing a lot of work on bikes, you won't have tools either. So I just used a punch and just gave it a sharp tap on the edge of the lug there, and it released it pretty easily. Unless your bike's really rusted up and hasn't been pulled apart for centuries, you'll find that it should undo okay with a sharp tap as long as you go the right way. So this now is what's tensioned up onto the bearing. I have loosened the other side already, and you'll now see that the shaft can move in and out, and it's got a bit of a wobble. When it's set right, and it's a matter of doing these retainers up to sandwich the bearings, there should be no end float, and there should be no lateral up and down or sideways. So that's loosened off now because I've undone the other side. So we'll just pull it all apart and I'll show you the bearings. The crank assembly and bearings are now out, and they're laid on the bench here. And you can see there's the crankshaft. The grease is particularly old and dried up in places and gluggy in other places. So there's the bearing in the cup there, and you can see how it rests in the cup, and when the cup is screwed into the hub, it presses the ball bearings up against this shoulder, and that's where the crankshaft runs on, and the same on this side. So we need to have, when we have this assembled, we need to have them done up tight enough that there's no play in the crank, but not so tight that the crank is hard to turn. So it looks like it's well overdue for a re-grease. We'll clean all this up. The bearings actually should come out of this cup. The balls actually stay in a little retainer. They look to be in good order, but they certainly need to clean up and re-grease. So we'll put them aside to do that. I've already got the chain over here soaking in some old petrol, and hopefully we'll check that to make sure it's not overly worn once it's had a good soak. So we don't have much of the bike left to go. We have the steering head, which has a very similar bearing set up. So there'll be a locking collar, and then we'll undo that and pull that apart. The crank's all good, all the back's right, we've only got the seat. So we'll pull the rest of this apart, and then we'll look at which part we're going to clean up first, and we'll start the process. Now, these older style steering headsets have a bearing on the top and a bearing on the bottom, much like the crank, but you have to undo a bolt at the top here, which allows the steering shaft to come out first, and then the steering fork will actually slide out that way. Now, what this long bolt does is it actually squashes or jams a piece of metal up underneath the pipe, and it's normally a tapered, like an angled piece. And so to release it, you need to undo the bolt, of course, but the tapered or the angled piece is probably still jammed up there. So usually you can just give it a bit of a tap. I'll have to find my hammer. Okay, I have my hammer. So I've loosened it off, but I haven't taken it right out, so it's still attached to the part it screws into. If we give us a bit of a tap, there we go, that's all it needed. So the angled piece inside here is now separated. We can take the bolt out now, and we should be able to slide the steering shaft out the top. There's the bolt, it's a long one. That's better, camera in the tripod. So I think it's going to be pretty tight because it hasn't been undone for a long time. I'm not sure. I think we could probably just use a rubber mallet. That's the locking collar for the bearing. I don't think it's tightening on the shaft there. And there we go. It was hanging on pretty tight. And here you can see the angled piece, and that's the piece that the long bolt screws into. So as the bolt tightens, it squashes that up, slides it up there, and jams against the sides of the steering tube, which secures your handles. The idea of giving the bolt a tap was to release that, and then you can undo the bolt. And that just fell back down the tube, and when I picked the frame up, it just fell on the floor. So that's how the steering is attached on these older bikes. Now we just have to get the bearings out, which is much the same as the crank. As I mentioned earlier, we have a locking collar, which is actually loose. And I might as well take this out while we're here. A couple of spacers. And as we loosen this collar, I don't know how tight this will be. Oh yeah, that's not too bad. As we loosen that collar, we're loosening the bearings, and then our steering shaft now has lots of slack. So we'll just dismantle this. I'll put the bearings in another tub, which will be washed up again. And we can re-grease it all when we assemble it. So the bike's just about finished as far as dismantling goes. The only other thing I've got to take off is the seat, which has a quick release lever here. And that looks like it's going to slide out really easily. I'll take that clamp off as well. And that will just leave us with the yellow frame, which I'll just give a wash up. And I'll clean out the old grease from the crank here, and once I get the steering assembly apart. And really that just needs a wash. That's all we're going to do with that. So that will do for part one of this Malvern Star bicycle restoration. I've got the frame all apart here. I took the steering fork out of the end there. The frame here has got chromed cups for the bearings, and they're pressed in so they can stay there. I've already washed this up and it's come up really good. The paint's in pretty good condition. So that completes the dismantle, except we have to do the wheels. We're going to re-grease it all, so we'll pull the wheels apart as well. A bit more complicated on the rear wheel here because we've obviously got the drive and a brake mechanism. So we'll pull those apart in the next episode. and everything else here is being washed up and cleaned. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next part. Bye.